here's the irony. You know, if you look at racism in the United States, this is, you know, I mean, this has been going on, you know, since since America was founded. You know, and then, and so even though we think we're making some impact, you know, there's this slip back. But that's not our topic for today.
No, it's good to talk about though. Like, yeah, and I appreciate your perspective on that, because I'm kind of curious to hear, you know, we see the media, but what's it really like, you know?
Yes. Yeah. But let me share one thing though, that I think is a segue to the conversation that we wanted to have today. And that is the whole notion of the situation with George Floyd, so distressing. I mean, every one of these murders and you know, senseless intimidation that's happened has ripped our hearts out. But when the thing with George Floyd that was provocative and I think really igniting this was the videotape of the killing of this man right in our faces, right? And when I watched that videotape, and you know, the angst and the horror that I felt really hearkened me back to my earliest days as a disability advocate, and this is when I was in college in the 60s, what went to a state school and hospital for folks with intellectual disabilities. It's called Polk State School and Hospital, I went there. Actually, I was writing a paper. I was in college. I was an undergraduate student, and so I went to this institution, Polk, to do some research for this paper. And you know, the things that I saw there were just unbelievably shook me. It shook me to my core in terms of how people were treated. You know, at that time, now this is the 60s, and I know that in Canada, you guys have had your whole sordid experience with institutions, but there were people in cages, and there were these large rooms, and people were hosed down in these rooms, and wow. You know, folks were restrained. It was absolutely, you know, it took my breath away. And it was at that moment, you know, I've always been interested in disability issues, growing up with a cousin who had Down syndrome and you know, supporting her as kids, but never seeing horrors like this, right? These systemic way that people with disabilities are treated. And the powerful juxtaposition between the George Floyd murder and the stuff I saw at Polk School and Hospital in 1967, the juxtaposition was, here were innocent people in Polk. Here was an innocent man laying on that street in Minneapolis, or at least innocent from a perspective that he hadn't been charged. You know, there had been an alleged, you know, rumor that he was passing counterfeit dollars, but nonetheless, here's an innocent person literally being mistreated unfairly, unjustly, and that was the exact same phenomena at Polk State School and Hospital. Here were innocent people, men and women with disabilities. They didn't ask to have their disability. They didn't, they didn't want their disability, and yet they were being treated in this unjust, devaluing, marginalized way. And the thing that really spurred me on, because at that moment, I was, you know, I was studying industrial psychology as an undergrad, and I was thinking that maybe I'll go and work in, you know, as a psychologist in a, you know, a factory or in a, you know, human relations kind of a role in industry. But seeing that that day that I went to tour Polk State School and Hospital, that's what really launched me as an advocate. And, you know, here I am, you know, some 60 years later, 55 years later, and still as fervent about the unfairness of how people are treated. And much like systemic racism, you know, we have, you know, systemic handicapism. We have systems that still see people with disabilities as less than, you know, that as incapable, as really a separate, almost like a separate species, right? And that notion of unfairness, innocence, and unfairness, I think are the driving force of passion for change. And, you know, I think our role as disability advocates is to be a bridge between innocence and unfairness, right? And to create a bridge back to valued roles and valued position in community. So, you know, I think that clearly, you know, these things are linked. And this sort of systemic thinking, this deeply seated notion that people with disabilities are either less than, or they, you know, created a sin that led way to their having a disability, or whatever madness might be in people's minds, is still alive and well in community. And obviously, the hostility that we saw in the George Floyd situation is, you know, that malevolence and the maliceness that policeman had as he was kneeling on this man's neck. I think that communities are not malevolently devaluing. I just think they are ignorantly devaluing people with disabilities. And so, you know, and I really think that job number one for us as disability advocates, I think today, is how do we change those attitudes in the community, right? I don't think our job is how do we take care of people with disabilities. I mean, obviously that's a part of things now, but the real core of this is how do attitudes and perceptions change in community, and how do people in community begin to rethink difference, whether that difference is racial difference, ethnic difference, religious difference, sexual orientation difference, disability related difference, age difference, poverty related difference. I think all of that is sort of commingled into this. And so it's a complex advocacy question. Obviously, we find ourselves right now, every one of us that are on this call, we find ourselves in the here and now, right? I mean, you know, we have people who we're providing supports to and for, and we have a responsibility to, you know, try to get people jobs and, you know, engaged opportunities in the community. But all of that is really predicated on the attitudinal base, the social architecture of culture, both attitudinally and architecturally, in terms of inclusion, welcoming, hospitality, and belonging. So, you know, these things are kind of, co-related, and I think that thinking about what do we do, how do we assemble, what kinds of changes do we make in how we support people to get to that goal.
Yeah, changing the attitudes. That's a big one. That's something I think about all the time as a support person is changing the attitudes. Yes, support is part of it, but the attitudes of like, how do we show the value of the people we support? And that's a big one that I'm always like really hustling and trying to figure out.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So
yeah, and I really believe, Hugo, that the core of that challenge, and you're absolutely right, that is a huge challenge, but I think the core of it is really found in relationships.
Yeah.
Because I think when people begin to build relationships, they begin to get beyond the differences that can polarize people, and they begin to see anew. Right?
Yeah.
Years ago, I guess it was maybe in 1994 or 95, I wrote a book called Beyond Difference. Right? It was my second book, and it was really an exploration, a macro exploration of how do we get beyond seeing some of the things that can cause us or stunt us in our expectations about other people, right? And it was really a sort of a deep cathartic work for me, because it was it pushed me to examine biases and stereotypes and assumptions that I was making, not just about disability, but about any kind of difference that again, this gets back to that whole array of racial issues, sexual orientation issues, age issues, poverty issues, that are differences that we have in our culture. But clearly, we're always going to have differences. We're never going to fix differences. As much as the micro approach suggests we try, right? Try to make people more functional or help people become more, more skillful at something. That's a micro technique. And although micro techniques, certainly have a place, I think, in our support patterns, but I think it's really the macro issue of how do we change those attitudes. And I think really at the core of that is relationships.
Relationships. So relationships is like the macro to